Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this Parks Institute Research Seminar. This is really wonderful to see such a large and international audience for this very special event on archives. So my name is Claire Foll. I am Associate Professor of Eastern European Jewish History and Culture at the University of Southampton in the United Kingdom, and I'm also the Director of the Parks Institute for the Study of Jewish non-Jewish relations. Let me just say maybe a few words on the Parks Institute, since there are so many new members of the audience tonight. So this is an interdisciplinary institute, a community of scholars, of archivists, librarians, and students here at the University of Southampton. It is named after the Reverend Dr. James Parks, who was ordained by the Church of England in 1926, and who spent all his life campaigning against the rise of racist nationalism and against anti-Semitism. He helped rescue Jewish refugees during the 1930s, and he campaigned for the Jews of Europe during the Holocaust. During the Second World War, he helped found the Council of Christians and Jews, and throughout his career, as an academic as well as an activist, he promoted religious tolerance and mutual respect between those of all faith and none. So James Parks wanted to donate his library to a university so that future generations could develop his research, and a home was found for his materials at the University of Southampton in 1964. So at the Parks Institute, we are furthering his legacy through our academic research and also public activities. This event is actually co-organized with the YIVO Institute, and I'm delighted to chair this event with Shelly Freeman, the YIVO Chief of Staff, who is from in Australia, and who will say more on how the idea of this event came about.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Claire. And I should say good evening, good morning, good afternoon to everyone, depending on where you are in the world. As Claire said, my name's Shelly Freeman, and I am the Chief of Staff at YIVO, and I'm delighted to be here with you all. For those who don't know, YIVO is the World Repository of Eastern European Jewish History. It has an archive of 23 million items and a library of nearly 400,000 volumes, and is the largest and most comprehensive collection of materials on Eastern European Jewish civilization in the world. We are also delighted to have a YIVO UK chapter that you'll be hearing from more this year with events that they'll be holding. This event was conceived exactly a year ago when Jonathan Brent, YIVO's CEO and Executive Director, who you'll hear from shortly, and myself were in London for a YIVO UK board meeting. At that time, we had a meeting with Claire and Professor Tony Kushner, and we discussed how interesting and significant it would be for us to have an event about our respective archives, or the archive of Southampton. And but we said, given that we're in New York and the Parks Institute is in London, it would have to be an online event. And we were wondering how that would go, but we thought it would still be a very good event. And it was a pity that we couldn't do it live, in person. Little did we know that online events would very soon be something we would all be all too familiar with. So on that note, and without any further ado, I'll hand it back to Claire, who will continue with the introductions.
Thank you very much, Shelly. This event is also an opportunity to bring in another important partner of the Parks Institute, so the Center for Jewish Studies Petersburg Judaica at the European History of St. Petersburg. And as mentioned by Shelly, initially we designed this event as a discussion about the archives of Eastern European Jews, so to understand how collections in different countries and different institutions had been shaped by different legal and historical contexts. So we will hear about this in the presentations given by the three different speakers. But of course, with the COVID crisis and the difficulties that all historians have faced in accessing archives in the last year, we have slightly changed the focus, and we would like also to take tonight's opportunity to have a discussion about how institutions have adjusted to the pandemic, and what are the perspectives and challenges for archives in an increasingly digital world. So the event will start with three presentations, 10-12 minutes by our key speakers on their respective archive collections or the collections that they have studied. Then we will have a discussion between them and the chairs, and then we will open the discussion. So you can use the Q&A function to ask questions and the chat also to post comments. So I will first introduce all the people in the order that they will speak. Jonathan Brent, welcome. He's the Executive Director of the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research in New York City. Before that, he was Editorial Director and Associate Director of Yale Press. He founded the world-acclaimed Annals of Communism series at Yale Press. And he is also a specialist of Soviet Jewish history. He's the co-author of Stalin's Last Crime, The Plot Against the Jewish Doctors, and Inside the Stalin Archives. And he is now working on a biography of the Soviet Jewish writer Isaac Babel. Aleksander Ivanov is the administrator of the Interdepartmental Center for Jewish Studies, Petersburg, Judaica, and is also a senior lecturer at the Faculty of Art History at the European University at St. Petersburg. And more importantly for us tonight, he is also the co-editor with Mark Kupowiecki of several guides of the Jewish sources in St. Petersburg archives, and he's a very good expert of all the post-Soviet archives. And our very own Karen Robson, who is the head of the archives and special collections at the Hartley Library at the University of Southampton. So please, now I open the floor to Jonathan.
Claire, before I start, can I share my PowerPoint?
Please do.
Okay, very good. So here we go. Can you see it?
No, not yet.
You cannot see it now?
No.
Okay. Let's see. Oh, I see. How's that?
Yes.
Yes.
Brilliant.
Wow.
All right, very good. Thank you very much, Claire. Thank you to the Parks Institute. Thank you to all of the panelists for this opportunity. And I also wish to welcome and acknowledge the chairman of YIVO's UK board, who is with us today at this event, Gordon Wasserman. The YIVO Institute was founded in Vilna, Poland in 1925. It was founded as it was founded in Vilna, Poland, but the original discussions for the YIVO Institute took place in Berlin. There was a Berlin chapter, a Warsaw chapter, and a Vilna chapter initially. In other words, the YIVO Institute was initially conceived as an international organization. It was not conceived of as only for one part of the Jewish people in one part of the Jewish world. Rather, it was conceived initially as an academy of higher learning for the Jewish people of Eastern Europe that would investigate its history, that would investigate its language, that would investigate its folk art, its folklore, that would investigate its political and social history, its literature, its music, its art. It was conceived of as a wide-ranging organization And in order for the YIVO Institute to begin its study, it was understood by Max Weinreich, who was the director of the Vilna, then Vilna, Poland, now Vilnius, Lithuania. It was understood by Max Weinreich that in order to study all of this, primary materials had to be collected to do so. And so an international Sammler campaign was started in 1925, centered in Vilna, that collected materials from all over the world, from Australia to Buenos Aires, to Japan, to the Middle East, to Moscow, to Petersburg, to Warsaw, to Chicago, to New York, to London. There were branches of the YIVO Institute that sprang up in multiple locations. There was a London branch of the YIVO Institute. There was a Paris branch of the YIVO Institute. There was a New York branch of the YIVO Institute, a Chicago branch of the YIVO Institute, and a Buenos Aires branch of the YIVO Institute. And all of these centers, these sub-centers, funneled material to the main location of Vilna, Poland. As a consequence of this massive effort that assembled materials dating from the 15th century, that included books, newspapers, magazines, artworks, puppets. Some of you may know the expression about bankes, as hilft ze wer teten bankes. Well, we collected bankes. We collected all kinds of instruments of cutlery for the kitchen. We and hospital materials, and so on and so forth. So our archive is vast, as Shelly mentioned, 23 million of the materials, 23 million objects and documents of Jewish material culture over 4 or 5 centuries. When the Nazis came in 1941, however, they seized YIVO, knowing of the riches of the YIVO Institute. But they couldn't read Yiddish, they couldn't read Polish, they couldn't read Russian, they couldn't read Hebrew for the most part. And therefore, they impressed Jewish workers of YIVO from the ghetto to come and to sort books for them and manuscripts that could be then sent to Germany. As a consequence, the YIVO archive and library, like many others, got split up. And the consequence of this is that our materials were in 2 different locations. Some of it was in Germany, and some of it had stayed in Lithuania. And here's a photograph of the famous poet Avram Sutzkever sorting books at the YIVO Institute in 1941 for transport to Germany. This is Shmerke Kaczerginski. This is a photograph of YIVO materials coming to the train depot before transportation to Germany. But at the end of the war, the US Army discovered these materials and sent them to New York, where fortunately Max Weinreich from Vilna had been able to relocate himself. This is a photograph of the materials, materials that eventually came back to YIVO, and all of these crates. These crates contained the documents and books that had originally been in Vilna. these form what we call the core of the Vilna collections, the YIVO primary Vilna collections that had been collected in Eastern Europe. However, what happened to all the materials that were still in Lithuania? This is a photograph of the YIVO building before the war, 1935, and this is a photograph of the building after the war. And this is Avram Sutzkever here, who had returned immediately after hostilities ceased to come and try to find the materials that he and his colleagues in what was called the Paper Brigade had hidden in various locations in the ghetto, had given to friends, Polish friends and Lithuanian friends to keep. And here in this rubble that you see were masses and masses and masses of shreds of books and manuscripts that had been hidden in the top of the YIVO building, the attic, which unfortunately was bombed by the Soviets when they were making their assault on Vilna. And consequently, the YIVO materials were in two places, in New York and in Lithuania. And nobody in New York really knew what had happened to the materials in Lithuania. This is a picture of Sutzkever and others going house to house in July 1944, collecting materials that they had hidden. This is a sample of some of the materials that they found. And when I gave a talk about YIVO in Vilnius, I showed this image, and a man in the front row started weeping, and I came up to him afterwards and I said, "Mark, is everything all right? I hope I didn't offend you by what I said." He said, "No, not at all." He said, "But that picture that you showed in the photograph, I never knew where it came from. It hangs above my desk in my office." And so this was, you know, a story that also helped to demonstrate that that which was saved and that which was found was not even kept all together in one place, that got scattered to a great extent. And nobody really quite knew what had become of it. Well, with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, and the opening up of the Soviet archives and all of the rest of that, the Lithuanian government started to look at its own holdings that had been hidden for the duration of the Soviet period. And among these materials, they found a very, very large quantity of materials from the YIVO Institute. They found them in this church, the Church of St. George, which had been transformed from the Church of St. George into the Lithuanian book chamber by the Soviets. And this is where the Lithuanian librarian Antanas Ulpis he saved YIVO's materials from Soviet destruction, and that's a beautiful long story that I cannot get into in the 10 minutes that Claire has allotted me. And so I won't, but it's a wonderful, wonderful story.
By the way, only 2 minutes left, Jonathan.
Okay, and he saved these materials. They were in the church, and in 1991, the Lithuanians discovered that material in this church. And with that discovery, it became known that there was much more to the Vilna collections than we had supposed. This is an image of what much of the material in the church looked like. Here is another. You can see they're torn, they're pasted together. They need a great deal of care. When we began the project to digitize the material in Lithuania with the material in New York City, the chief archivist in Lithuania said of the 150,000 documents that they had found, she estimated at least 60,000 of them required urgent conservation care. And so we began what is called the Edward Blank YIVO Vilna Collections Project to care for all of these materials, to conserve them, to piece them all back together again, so that we can reunite via digital means the New York side of our collection with the Lithuanian side of the collection. And I can tell you that there are some documents that we have in New York, the last half of which we found in Lithuania. So our collection really was pulled apart, much like the Jewish people itself was pulled apart by the Holocaust. I also want to mention that Antanas Ulpis didn't simply put everything in this one location. He also sent material to the Wroblewski Library in Vilna. And when I came to the Wroblewski Library and I saw the materials that they had on a table, some 20,000 documents, and I said to the director, these materials have been in your library in unopened boxes since 1948? She said, yes. I said, well, what have you been waiting for? She said, we've been waiting for you, which sent chills down my spine. But the Lithuanians preserved this material, saved this material. It is our intent now to digitize it and to make it public, free to a world public on a website. We have now more than digitized half of the material, and we expect to complete the whole of this project by the end of this year, so that the entire world will have access to this tremendous account of Jewish life spanning 3 or 4 different centuries. So
Thank you, Jonathan.
Claire is nodding.
Yes.
I have to respect that. And I will be very happy to answer any questions that anyone may have at the end of the proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Can you stop sharing your screen, please?
Yes.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you. Aleksander Ivanov now from St. Petersburg.
So do you see the
Yes.
PowerPoint presentation? Okay. So thank you, Claire. I would like to say that it is a special privilege for me to be invited to take part in this online meeting, not only because I have been involved in Jewish studies for more than last 20 years, but because I am primarily engaged in investigation of source materials dealing with Jewish history and culture in Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian archives. In this connection, I am happy to share with you the updated information concerning our Jewish Archival Survey project initiated by the Jewish Theological Seminary from New York. The project has been carried out during the last 3 decades under directorship of Professor David Fishman. Sorry, back. 10 easy-to-use guides to Jewish documentary sources in depositories of Moscow, St. Petersburg, Kiev, Odessa, Minsk, and some other cities have been already published within the framework of our Jewish Archival project. I am currently working on compiling a guide to Jewish documentary sources in archives of Lviv, Lemberg in Ukraine. Hopefully, this volume will be released next year. In addition, English translation of a significant part of these descriptions of archival record groups included in the above-mentioned guidebooks will be available on the website Yerusha this summer, I hope. All these demonstrate that the main goal of our Jewish Archival Survey project sooner or later will be achieved. Further, I will try to tell you about Jewish archival collection preserved in depositories of my native city, St. Petersburg, Russia. The remarkable feature of the Jewish archival project here is that its fulfillment was closely connected with the revival of St. Petersburg as a European center of Hebrew and Jewish studies, as it had been considered at the beginning of the 20th century. In this regard, it is necessary to recollect that the first Jewish museum in Russia was opened in our city in 1916. It is true that the Petersburg Jewish community is famous for the scholars who organized several Jewish research institutions, such as the Jewish Historical and Ethnographic Society, 110 years of which foundation we celebrated 2 years ago. Among outstanding Jewish scholars and collectors who worked in Petersburg, one can mention a philanthropist and bibliophile Leo Friedland, Hebraist and Orientalist Daniil Khvalson, world-famous Jewish historian Shimon Dubnov, Hebraist, Orientalist, and historian Abraham Garkavi, a playwright, ethnographer, and public figure Semyon Ansky, who organized the Jewish Museum in Petersburg, and later he was among the founders of the YIVO Institute in Vilna. Collections of medieval Hebrew manuscripts and artifacts of Jewish folk art compiled by these scholars and their personal papers are preserved in archives of St. Petersburg. All these materials are of the highest cultural and scientific value, and this fact gave a special foreshadowing for the Jewish archival project in our city. Of great interest to the researchers and especially for genealogists are the Jewish metrical books preserved with some gaps from 1856 to 1918 in archives of our city. It should be pointed out that the situation with investigation and presentation of Jewish documentary sources in Petersburg archives is rather controversial. From the one hand, it is possible to say that a few collections of Jewish documents, photographs, and artifacts have been currently shown at several exhibitions in Petersburg Museum, archives, and libraries. Among the recent ones, I will mention a large permanent exhibition, History and Culture of the Jews in Russia, at the Russian Ethnographic Museum, and a temporal exhibition entitled Be My Wife According to the Law of Moses and Israel at the Museum of the History of Religion. The both exhibitions, due to excellent quality of displayed items, made a steady attention and interest of the audience. From the other hand, not all Jewish documentary collections preserved in Petersburg archives has been processed and are available to researchers. For example, 2 years ago, I have processed and described a collection of personal papers of the Petersburg Crown Rabbi Abram Drapkin. This collection is deposited in the archive of the Russian Ethnographic Museum. It would not be an exaggeration to say that Abram Drapkin was one of the key figures in Petersburg Jewish community building during the 1870s until 1910. And materials of his personal collection allow us to expand significantly our notions about activities of the Petersburg Jewish community in that period. The problem of processing and describing Jewish documentary collection can be explained in some measure by the fact that until comparatively recent time, Jewish source materials have been available in Russia to a very limited degree. In the Soviet time, there was no any research institutions engaged in systematical Jewish studies. Even after the perestroika, when the Russian depositories have been opened for the public, a large part of archival collection related to Jewish topics was not described and available to the scholars. Because of the lack of specialists in Hebrew and Jewish studies, there is often no any person in the staff of Petersburg archives who by common consent would perform as an expert and to whom the visitors would turn to help. I hope that the guidebooks of the Petersburg series will help researchers in working with Jewish collections in the archives of our city. Next, I will try to describe very briefly a few Jewish documentary collections stored in the archives of St. Petersburg. First is the manuscript department of the National Library of Russia, which contains several collections of Hebrew manuscripts, a large number of personal files of famous Jewish scholars, writers, public figures of the 18th, 20th century. Among them are personal papers of Sholem Aleichem, Mendele Moichers Forim, Daniel Holson, and Abram Garkavi. The real treasure of the National Library of Russia is the Abraham Ferkovich collection, which includes about 17,000 medieval Hebrew manuscripts and fragments. It is certainly one of the largest and most important collections of Hebrew manuscript in the world, and its historical and scientific significance cannot be overestimated. A distinctive feature of the Russian Ethnographic Museum, which inherited collections of the Petersburg Jewish Museum after it was closed by the Soviet Authority in 1929, is a large number of artifacts brought by Semyon Ansky from his historical and ethnographic expedition to the steppes of Ukraine in 1912-1914. The museum archive contains in its holdings such excellent pieces of Jewish art as the Passover Haggadah from the 14th century Spain, illuminated prayer books of the 17th century from Eastern Europe, collections of Pinkasim, Ketubot, Mizrahim, and Jewish folk pictures Lubok from Jewish communities of Ukraine of the 18th, 19th century, as well as a photo collections of Jewish types, synagogues, ritual objects, Jewish tombstones, and pieces of Jewish folk art of the early 19th century. Next come the archives of the Russian Literature Institute, the so-called Pushkin House of the Russian Academy of Sciences. Probably it is the foremost depository in the city, which contains about 3 million of precious autographs of writers, scholars, and political figures. In its manuscript department, we discovered 5 collections with letters of Semyon Ansky, personal papers of the historian Shimon Dubnov, whom I mentioned above, and the collection of documents related to famous Zionist activist and writer Vladimir Zeev-Zhabotinsky. Of special interest is a unique collection of Jewish folk music recorded on the Edison wax cylinders, which is preserved in the phonogram archives of the Pushkin House. It contains more than 1,000 historical recordings made from 1911 to 1938 in the Ukraine and Belarus. These recordings represent the painstaking work of well-known folklorists and ethnomusicologists such as Yuli Engel, Zinovy Kyzelgov, Sofia Maget, and Moisei Beregovsky. And the last but not least is the archive of the Museum of Anthropology and Ethnography, also known as Kunstkamera. Among our discoveries, there was a collection of Jewish ethnographic photographs of the early 19th sent to the museum by amateur photographers from different parts of the Russian Empire. The photographs depict Jewish types, Jewish scenes, synagogues, Jewish houses, and shtetl streets. And these collections was never been an object of scholarly attention before. So I think that I will stop here, and thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Aleksander. And now we move to Karen Robson from Southampton. Please.
Hello, I'm very welcome. I'm very pleased to be with you today. My talk today will look at the Jewish collections that we hold at Southampton. I shall start with a brief introduction to how they came here, and then talk about some curatorial considerations, what the collections are, and something of the work that we do to make them available. So why do we have Jewish collections at Southampton? 1990 could be seen as one of the significant years in the development of the special collections, for it was then that the Anglo-Jewish archives arrived at our door. The University Library did already hold some of the library of Claude Montefiore, who had been its president in the early part of the 20th century. And it was in 1964, as Claire mentioned earlier, that the Reverend Dr. James Parks gave his library and archives to the university. Yet Southampton was not a centre for Jewish archive collections. What changed this was a crisis in terms of preserving the Jewish archival heritage in the 1980s. The Jewish Historical Society of England had begun to collect material in the 1950s under a subgroup called the Anglo-Jewish Archives. This was housed in but not owned by the University College London. However, in the 1980s, UCL was no longer able to house this temporary collection, and Southampton stepped up and offered to provide it with a home. The arrival of the Anglo-Jewish Archives in 1990 effectively doubled the existing manuscript holdings that we had in an instant, and the holdings have continued to grow in the succeeding decades. They're now around 3.5 million items, which are arranged in about several hundred collections. So, a number of curatorial considerations. Southampton collects and curates its archives within the UK National Archival Framework. In terms of collecting, archival organisations have agreed collecting policies, usually ratified by their own institution, and our acquisitions policy was approved by the University Senate in 1992 and is lodged with the National Commission on Historical Manuscripts, which is now the National Archives. It is the professional practice that archival institutions do not compete with others in acquiring new archival material and seek to avoid conflict with other repositories. So Southampton's Jewish collections focus on Anglo-Jewry, whilst, for instance, the London Metropolitan Archives collects archives of London-based organisations. The Jewish archive collections that we hold are what might be termed private records as opposed to public records, and public records are defined by and the regulations for their safekeeping as set out under the Public Records Act. Private archives or records are essentially chattels or property that can be disposed of as their owner desires. Such private collections come from a range of individuals or organisations and are usually acquired through the following methods: deposit, gift, bequest or purchase. They are then curated in accordance with codes of practice, British standards and legislation such as copyright, data protection and freedom of information. Archives might be historic records retained for their value as evidence, but they are also records created by and about people, and as such they are subject to legislation. With more modern material, which can contain information about living individuals, data protection applies, and requests for access to material have to be balanced by the requirements of protecting the rights of individuals under law, and this becomes even more pertinent in the digital environment. Copyright is another issue that creates challenges for the archivist. Since copyright does not lapse until the statutory period expires, there will always be a copyright owner. It is often finding this copyright owner that is the issue. The ownership of material and the ownership of copyright are distinct. So letters are the copyright of their authors, not of their recipients. Copyright can be inherited by the heirs of authors or owners of material, and after time, knowledge of ownership can be lost and current owners of copyright impossible to trace. Works such as these are termed orphan works. A scheme under EU copyright law allowed material to be classified as orphan works, and this was used as a means to permit material to be made available digitally. I can't say that word very well. However, the recent withdrawal of the UK from the EU has removed this exemption in the UK, and the taking down of the online Spare Rib magazine by the British Library is just one direct example of this situation. So what then is the scope of the Jewish Archive collections at Southampton? There are several hundred separate collections ranging in size from a single folder to about 2,500 archival boxes of papers, mainly dating from the 19th and 20th centuries. The material is wide-ranging and provides an important source for the study of Jewish community in the United Kingdom. The collections encompass papers of individuals and families and of organisations with a national or sometimes international focus. For while its focus is Anglo-Jewry, the collections reflect the migratory nature of the Jewish community and its global ties. Papers of individuals include those of well-known figures in the Anglo-Jewish community, such as Selig Louis or Israel Zangwill, private papers of three chief rabbis, that's Adler, Hertz and Brodie, and of members of families such as the Henriques, the Swathelings and the Whaley Cohens. The collections also encompass material of lesser well-known individuals that offer a fascinating insight into the many different facets of the Anglo-Jewish experience. For instance, the 45 volumes of Samuel Rich, which he termed his Journal of a Minor Anglo-Jewish Communal Official, covering the period 1904 to 1949, are an eloquent commentary on the developments of the Jewish community in London, at the Jews Free School where he taught, and on national and international events. The experience of Jewish refugees in Great Britain in the 1930s and 40s is documented in, among others, papers of the Adler family from Vienna, who were befriended by the Stott family, and papers of the Van Zyl family, which includes material of Rabbi Werner van der Ziel's relating to his interment on the Isle of Man. The Anglo-Jewish Archives likewise includes papers of individuals and families who migrated to the UK. Two examples are Samuel Kraus, who was professor of the Jewish seminaries in Budapest and Vienna, and the Leicester correspondent of the Jewish Chronicle, Trudy Dubb, who was born in Poland and fled to the UK with her husband in 1939. The archives of organisations similarly encompass a vast spectrum of activities within the Jewish community, including philanthropy and social work, education, women's rights, religious practices and observances. The archives of the Jewish Board of Guardians and of the Association of the Protection of Girls, Women and Children provide considerable information on the UK Jewish community's response to mass immigration from Eastern Europe and Russia in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. We also hold extensive material from the Institute of Jewish Affairs and the British section of the World Jewish Congress, the latter of which provides an invaluable source for the situation of the Jewish communities in Nazi-occupied Europe in the 1930s and 40s, as well as material relating to Jewish communities across the world in the post-war period. The Anglo-Jewish Association Archive likewise has an international focus, with material on communities across the world and for Eastern Europe for the period 1945 to 60. Within the archives of Rabbi Solomon Schoenfeld is a large section of material relating to the work of the Chief Rabbi's Religious Emergency Council, its refugee work, and its reconstruction and rescue work in post-war Europe, including in Poland. Other papers relating to refugees in the Second World War can be found in the archives of the Polish Refugee Fund and of the West London Synagogue. So something on the work with the collections. Special Collections seeks to curate and promote its collections through a number of strands of work. Alongside its ongoing programme of cataloguing to create descriptions of the material, There is an emerging programme for digitisation and creating online resources, which includes online exhibitions, blogs and other social media. A recent project has seen the creation of catalogue descriptions of the content for the Secretary's letterbooks for the Jewish Board of Guardians, covering the period 1880s to 1940, which is now available online. The item-by-item catalogue descriptions make the information contained in these volumes easily accessible for the first time. And the volumes contain case studies from the 1880s to the early 1900s, as well as material relating to assistance for emigration. We have also digitised the archives of the Anglo-Jewish Association to the end of 1945 with accompanying catalogue descriptions. They are currently available on our virtual reading room on the library's digital viewer. As well as its own online catalogues and resources, Special Collections makes its collection descriptions available as part of collaborative projects, such as the Archives Hub and through the National Archives Discovery Catalogue. We've also been part of the East-European Jewish Archives Portal project, as already been said, this is due to be launched later this year. We're currently in the process of migrating our catalogues to a new archive management system, which will work in conjunction with a new library digital viewer. The Archives Management System catalogue will enable a greater capacity for searching across the breadth of our collections, enhancing the user experience. It will also enable the enhanced capacity to deal with digital and digitised media, supporting programmes of work in this area. The Special Collections at Southampton continues to develop and grow in terms of collections, activities and resources that it's creating. The COVID-19 has created many challenges, but it has also created opportunities, and we look forward to exploring these opportunities as we go forward. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Karen, and thank you to all three speakers for keeping to the time perfectly, and also for giving this overview of so different collections and different content and clearly different histories of the constitution of these collections. So we'll open the discussion first. We have two questions. Shelly, do you want to open?
Again, thank you to each of the panelists for your fascinating accounts. My question to each of you, and you know, obviously 2020 and the beginning of 21 has still been very challenging for everyone. And I wanted to ask how each of your institutions have tackled the pandemic, how you've changed, how you've moved, how you've kind of risen to the occasion. So maybe we'll start with Jonathan.
When the, thank you, Shelly, for the question. When the pandemic hit, it was very obvious that we were going to lose our in-person community. And YIVO, because of a historical obligation to make as much of our material as available as possible, began to put as much as possible online. We amplified all of our digital programs, our educational programs, our public programs. We expanded our YouTube collection of materials. And we have furthermore continued very vigorously to digitize and make as available as possible all of our materials online. This has proved to be so popular and so successful that many of the things that we did by necessity at the beginning of the pandemic, we will continue to do, even when it's over. For instance, our educational programs have grown threefold over this period of time, because now people from England and California and Buenos Aires can join our programs. There was one lady in New Zealand who would wake up at 4:30 in the morning to join program. And what this says to me is that there is a tremendous need worldwide among Jewish people to be connected to their heritage.
Thanks, Jonathan. And before moving on to Aleksander, I just wanted to say, although it wasn't necessarily planned to be launched during the time of COVID, but also I understand, you know, we launched the first exhibition of an online museum, and having an online museum is we've never done that before, and it just happened to coincide with COVID 2020. I don't know if you just want to quickly say something about that.
Sure. The online museum was in many ways an extension of the Edward Blank YIVO Villa Collections project. And we had gained so much expertise in the process of digitization through the Edward Blank project that we felt very confident that we could take it another step. Why did we want to take it another step? Because the majority of Jewish people around the world cannot read Yiddish, Hebrew, Russian, Polish, Ukrainian, Lithuanian, or most of the languages, even English, in which so many of our documents are written. And therefore, even by putting them on the web, what have we accomplished? We are only sharing them with other scholars. I feel, and the YIVO Institute was initially conceived to share these with the entire Jewish world. Well, in this historical period that we are in, that means translation into English. And so the online museum was conceived of to take materials from our archive, to digitize them, put them online, and translate them into English, and create a sufficient narrative surrounding each of the objects so as to provide real understanding of historical context.
Thank you, Jonathan. And Aleksander, same question to you. How has your institution tackled the pandemic?
Yes, thank you, Shelly. I should say that our European university where I work was completely closed during the lockdown in the last year and at the beginning of this year. So we made all our lectures online, and I should say that it was quite okay. But many of my colleagues complained that due to closing archives for researchers in connection with the coronavirus pandemic, they have to postpone their research project. That was the most important thing. For example, in our center, we had 3 quite large research projects. For example, at present, only large state archives in St. Petersburg are in work, but with very limited access to documents. And for example, institutional archives, like, for example, the archive of the Russian Ethnographic Museum, yes, that have a rather small reading rooms, are still closed because they cannot provide the sanitary norms introduced in Russia in connection with the pandemic. So what we had to do at that time. So there were 3 opportunities. First, it was possible to order digital copies of the necessary documents in archives for a fixed fee. But however, such orders can take months to complete. And the prices in Russia for digitalized copies are very high, from $10 to $60. Yes. Then another opportunity, it was possible, of course, to refer to some websites that contains copies of some archival documents. And for example, I will mention the website named Zikharon, which contains digital copies of historical documents related to repressive policy in the Soviet Union towards its Jewish citizens. It's very good and very rich site. And another option is to refer to various published collections of archival documents. And For example, I will mention just the almanac entitled Archive of Jewish History, and there were published 10 volumes of this book, and it's really very helpful. And then there was just, I think a week ago, I received a copy of the first volume of the series called Soviet Geniza, and it contains documents on the history of the Soviet Jewry from 1910s to 1980s, and the edition will be continuing to future. Of course, in this way, it is not always possible to find the documents just necessary for your research, but I should say that it is better than nothing.
Thank you, Alexander. That's very interesting to learn about those things. Karen, what about you and your institute?
Well, the institute was, we were actually closed for part of the time in 2020. Libraries were actually not allowed to be open for part of the time, but we reopened our reading room as soon as we were able to and run services. We did actually on-site teaching course sessions in the autumn of 2020. We did obviously continue to support research inquiries and our researchers as much as possible throughout the period, even if we had very limited access to our collection, our physical collections throughout that time. However, we also explored ways of making things available as much as we could online. So we've developed a YouTube channel and we're starting to add films to that. We created a number of online resources. We've also started experimenting with online exhibitions. But I suppose to a certain extent that slightly less visible, but obviously will be very significant, is sort of building the foundation stones of our new online catalogue system, contributing to the Eurusha project, and sort of creating all the things that will enable us to take forward programs of more cataloguing descriptions, but also the sort of digital programs that we will want to take forward, going, as we go forward this year.
Karen, I just wanted to ask, when you put some of your programs online, did you find that attracted, like Jonathan was saying, with YIVO, when they put stuff online, they were finding that they were getting audiences from all around the world and across?
Oh yes, I think we found that.
Did you have that same experience?
Yes, we have. I mean, I've done things not particularly related to our Jewish collections, but I've done things like MOOCs before, and yes, the interest that it creates is worldwide. Yes, I mean, if you just look at the inquiries that we have, they are actually from people all across the world. So the more resources we put online, the more interest in our collections we attract. Indeed, yes.
Okay, that's my question. That's my question, and it's interesting to see how this pandemic has sort of led to this more global, global interest in all of our respective organisations. So there's always a silver lining, I suppose. Claire, over to you for the next question.
Thank you very much, Shelly. And just to say, Aleksander, there is a lot of interest in the websites that you mentioned. I wonder if you could put the link in the chat, Zicharon and the other website, or is it accessible? Well, okay. If you can find it, it's great. Or you send it to me afterwards.
Yes, because I will have to find it.
Yeah. I'll post it on our YouTube channel later.
Yes, I will certainly find the links and share it with all the audience, but later, okay?
Yeah, no problem. Thank you. Just another question from us, and then we will open because there are lots of questions from the audience. As specialists, directors of institutions, archivists, etc., what do you think is the prospect for increasing online access to the archival collections, and what are the obstacles to mass digitization of archives, if there are any? I mean, legal, institutional, cultural, etc. Shall we start with Jonathan again?
Well, I think the opportunities are plenty. I think that at least in the case of YIVO, we are digitizing as much as we possibly can. It serves several purposes, one of which is mass distribution of our material, but the second is preservation of our material, both ensuring the record is preserved, but also by virtue of digitizing, we minimize the amount of touching of materials that will happen when people visit our reading room. And so we are also helping to maintain the stability of the materials of the documents. The greatest obstacle, yes, there are copyright issues, but frankly, we have not discovered that there are major copyright issues, except in the cases where we know the author is living. And in the case of certain estates, like the Chagall estate, like the Einstein estate, and so on and so forth. But for documents from the 17th century, for us, you know, maybe there is some person still alive who can trace his or her lineage back that far, but for the most part, our policy is put it online. If somebody raises a legal objection, then we take it offline. But the main obstacle to all of this is one thing: money. We have 23 million documents. We have 400,000 books. We have Yiddish theater. We have manuscripts of Sholem Aleichem. We have materials of Ansky. We have 10,000 rare rabbinical books. All of these things, we have 7 million documents relating to the Holocaust at YIVO. In order to begin any of these projects, we need people to pay attention. We need the larger Jewish world of philanthropy to pay attention to the crucial value these documents, these archives, these institutions have in the life of the Jewish people worldwide. Without this foundation in history, our people has become disconnected in a way in the United States that is really, I think, very dangerous for the future. So the biggest issue, getting people to pay attention.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Jonathan. Aleksander.
Okay. So I think that also the most important problem is money. Yes, but Russia is a specific country, and all this problem can be seen something like upside down. For example, because of the lockdown, there was announced a project according to which the state archives had to post digital copies of documents from their holding on their website for free access of the scholars. Yes, it was very good idea. But however, only just a few documents appeared in public domain on the archives website. The point is that archives are not interested in this kind of publication of the documents from their collections. In this case, they will lose part of their income received as payment for copying the documents. So that was the main problem in Russia with digitalization, all the documents and posting them on the website. As for our center, the Interdepartmental Center for Jewish Studies and the St. Petersburg Judaica, we have a collection of original photographs from Ansky expeditions, yes, that I mentioned before, and we are going to make a special website, and all the photos from our collection, there are about 350 original photo prints, will be available for the scholars. But again, we need time for that. Yes, we need some support, some financial support for this program, but I hope that in 1 year, in the next year, we will be able to complete this project.
Thank you very much. And Karen?
Well, yes, money is obviously going to be an issue that I mentioned, but I would say that there is very much the momentum for what they're calling a digital shift within Research Libraries UK, within the archival sort of archival world within the UK. So I would say that, you know, yes, more material will become digitized. It's just creating the capacity, building the capacity to be able to do that, how you finance it, the data storage. There's also all the legal issues that we need to consider. But yes, there will be much more digitization, and that shift towards having collections more online. That's something you will see very much more in the future.
That's interesting, actually, to hear that the problem is not that much legal, which I thought would be the main problem, than financial, actually.
Well, I mean, obviously there are legal things to do, but yeah, you do need to have to be able to pay and sort of, you know, create all the infrastructures for doing a mass digitization project. So that is one of the considerations you have to think of as well. Yeah.
Thank you. So now we are open to the questions from the floor. There are a few. Please send more if you would like. So Karl Krotke-Krander is asking, can Aleksander expand on what types of materials the Yerusha website will contain? Or Karen, I guess, could also answer.
Okay, there will be the so-called descriptions of archival collections, yes, from different archives, and I hope that there will be several thousands of descriptions of archival materials in many collections, for example, in Petersburg, Minsk, and some Kiev and Lviv also. Not so they publish not exactly the documents, but the descriptions of the documents. Yes, that's a little bit the difference. So these materials will give a hint how it is possible to find the exact document that you need in one or another archival collection.
Thank you very much. Karen, do you want to add anything? Or?
No, I think that covers everything. It really is a collaborative database bringing together information about all the collections. But if you think the fact that it stretches across the whole of Europe, the idea that you can bring together all the, you know, like types of material that are held in lots of repositories across Europe, I mean, it's a fantastic new sort of resource.
And very valuable for Eastern Europe, where we know that all the Jewish sources are spread in so many different institutions. Yeah. Another question to Aleksander about where all documents or list of museums in Petersburg, or were there also some in Moscow or elsewhere that you mentioned? And are any documents from the Russian State Historical Archive in St. Petersburg digitized and available online?
No, I don't think that, no. I don't think that many documents of Jewish interest are available online. For example, there is a large collection of for example, it is collection of records of Petersburg Choral Synagogue. It about 11,000 documents. And only one document is available on the website on the Central Historical Archive of St. Petersburg. So that's you know, the results of this project of the overall digitalization of all the documents and posting them on the website. So it's very few documents you can find now online from Petersburg archives, like, for example, the Russian State Historical Archive or Central Historical Archive of St. Petersburg. So just a few documents.
Thank you, Aleksander.
It's really a problem.
A question to Karen now from Harriet de Coven. English was a transshipment point for Jewish East Europeans in the late 19th century and early 20th century, who after some years moved on to North American ports. Do the archives contain information documenting arrival from Eastern European originating points? Well, I guess that Jonathan could also answer.
We might have material here, but there are also it may be that it's more likely that they would find material in the various sections of things like Home Office papers and others at the National Archives that cover immigration into the UK. It really depends whether individuals were assisted by some of the organisations for whom we have archives here at Southampton. Yeah. But they're very welcome. If they'd like to contact the archives, we'll be very happy to look into their inquiry for them.
Jonathan, do you want to?
Well, I would say I would sort of echo what Karen said. Send an inquiry and we will investigate. Every day we find out new things about what we have in our archive. It is surprising all the time. We have a huge archive on immigration, and there may well be some materials in there that pertain to this subject.
Thank you. Now, another question about how are archives updating their policies and fee structure to reflect this new digitized world. With an increase in accessibility via digitization, are you updating your approach to images being used online as part of digital exhibitions, social media posts, and blogs? Karen and Jonathan, so has it changed anything on your institutional policies, fee structures?
Karen, do you wish to go first? Or? Okay, yes, it has. It has liberalized those policies quite a bit. Our policy at YIVO has undergone a change over these last 5 years or so, from one of that might not have been that different from the one that Aleksander describes in Russia, of really hoarding material, protecting it, keeping it, keeping control over it, to recognizing that people have to have access to it, and that there's as much of an obligation to preserve as there is to disseminate. And so wherever we can, we have sought solutions to these problems that optimize our ability to get materials out. So for instance, someone can come into our archive, and once it's opened again, people will be able to do that. Come into our archive and take their digital camera and actually make their own digital images. And at one time this was prohibited, now we have allowed it. Our fee structure really just represents what we feel are our costs in terms of maintenance and a certain amount of overhead, but we tried to make it, I mean, Aleksander was saying that Xerox copies in Russia can cost
$60.
$60. Imagine how these restrictions are restricting knowledge. And when you restrict knowledge, you restrict culture. And when you restrict culture, you restrict people's ability to be alive. And so we are trying very much at YIVO to take an opposite approach.
In terms of our policies, I would say that we have, in the sense, liberalised anything that we make available online. We understand that people can reuse it, and there is obviously no charge for that. We probably have also reduced our costs where it comes to sort of reprographic service that we do offer. That's just something that we review on a periodic basis, but it's something we probably will review in the light of the current situations as well, and we will continue to review.
Oh, sorry, was I muted? No. Yeah, Aleksander, do you want to add something?
No, yes, I quite agree with Jonathan, because it is not possible to somehow to limit access to culture. Yes, there should be some financial support for this kind of digitalization projects, but you know, Russia is a specific country. Everything is quite different here. So that's, you know, the point.
Yes. Okay, now a very interesting and broad questions to all three of you about how do you decide what to digitize first? So do you begin with those most in need of preservation, or do you begin with materials based on their format, for example, images, or do you begin with the material which is most often requested? Who wants to start? Jonathan, again?
I can say why we chose the Vilna collections as the first major project. We chose it because this is our heritage. This is where YIVO came from. These are the materials that were originally collected. They were the victims of the Holocaust. And so it seemed very important institutionally as well as historically to begin with this collection. We have a second enormous collection, equally very much part of our institutional legacy, which is the Bund. The Bund archive that we have is even larger than the Vilna Collections archive, and that will be the next project that we undertake. However, because we are the second largest archive in the world of materials pertaining to the Holocaust, we are also very intent on initiating projects that will take parts of our Holocaust collection and digitize them. We feel that it's very important to take discrete parts. So for instance, eyewitness testimonies, for instance, children's matters pertaining to children, matters pertaining to ghettos, matters pertaining to you know, sites of extermination. All of these different elements can be approached separately. And because raising money for this is so difficult, and every archive faces it, we feel that we have to find projects, not just documents, in order to raise the money that's sufficient to do a proper job.
Thank you. Karen, do you want to?
Yeah, I would say that we will probably be focusing on things in a number of areas. I quite agree that we probably would be focusing on projects, and that's when we digitised the Anglo-Jewish Association, that was a discrete project for a significant organisation of material that was very, very popular and was used quite a lot. And I think that's one of the reasons we might focus on particular collections. But we also have material that's in formats that needs transferring into digital formats, so analog type formats, or ones that need some sort of work on them. So, you know, they need some work to make them accessible. So there would be another sort of strand there. And there also will be items that need preservation, and so that they're not handled very much. We would want to think about digitizing those as well. So I think we would be looking at things in a number of different sort of ways, and prioritizing and seeing which are the ones that that we might be able to focus on as the sort of different types of projects and take forward that way. So I think that would be that's definitely going to be our approach in this. Okay, thanks.
Does it mean it depends on money and on finances and funding?
It is, but I mean, as you say, if you're actually packaging these things as projects, you can then look for external funding to be able to do these. I mean, one of the funding sources in the UK, well, probably not just the UK, obviously, because it supported Eurasia, but I mean, Rothschilds is one of those organisations that have been very generous in supporting all sorts of different projects across Europe. So they are one place that you may be able to look to financing. But there are other sort of funding streams to a certain extent that if you find the right sort of project, you might be able to be able to finance those.
Yeah. Aleksander, do you have a...
But I will offer quite a pragmatic solution of this problem. I think that first of all, there should be digitalized those documents that are often ordered by the visitors in archives. And I think that it's quite easy to understand what these documents are. To my opinion, if we speak about, for example, archives in Petersburg, and perhaps not only in Petersburg, there should be digitalized Jewish metrical books, because they are always ordered by a lot of people. Yes, and then I think that materials from all this Ansky collection, it is also very often ordered, and we received a lot of letters. And for example, in many archives, there are also some documents from Ansky expeditions, and this is a treasure of our city, I think, of our city archives. And another, but I don't think that it is possible, and partly it is done, there should be digitalize the collection of medieval manuscripts from the manuscript department of the Russian National Library, because it's always often. But I know that these materials are already digitalized, but they are not on the website. So that's my idea.
Thank you very much. Maybe just a final question. I can't take all the questions, but one which is probably impossible to answer. But Olga Petrova is asking, is it possible to say where the largest and more comprehensive collection of documents on Jewish history in Russia is, or are they all dispersed? Do you have any views on this?
Yes, but of course it is dispersed, you know, all over. We can call the countries of the former Soviet Union. We have a lot of archives there with very interesting documents about the Russian Jewry, for example, and all over the world too. For example, in YIVO archive, there are some very valuable materials about Russian Jews, and so all over the world. In Germany, so I had an opportunity to work, for example, in German archives in Berlin, and there are also a lot of documents about Russian Jewish immigrants and some Jewish public organizations that were founded in St. Petersburg, for example, but then they continued their operation in Berlin and so on. It's, you know, scattered all over the globe, I should say.
I must add that actually the archive of the history of the Jewish people in Jerusalem have
Yes, absolutely.
digitized and copied lots of documents from the
Yes,
former.
you are right. Yes.
So it's a nice actually center where you can start.
Yes, exactly. And I think that many documents are available online there also.
Yeah.
If I could add just one
Yes,
short
please.
thing. My experience is that not only are materials scattered all over the globe, but they are often hidden in other collections. So
Yes.
that you have to really search in a penetrating way in many different places, and on the surface of it, the archival note, the folder note, may not even reveal these things. So you have to be a real investigator.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
And that's why the work that Aleksander and his colleagues are doing is so valuable. Thank you so much. We can't take more questions, but I'm so grateful to all three speakers and to the YIVO and Petersburg Judaica. It was so interesting to listen to you and to be able to understand the different directions. So we will post this video in YouTube, and I will try to add all the links that were mentioned during the discussion. Have a lovely day.
Night.